ውድ ተከታታዮቻችን ከዚህ ቀጥሎ ይዘንላችሁ የቀረብነው ቪዲዮ የዶክተር ጄሪ ማርዚንስኪን እና የጆርጅ ያጋቲን ምስክርነት ሲሆን በዚህም ውስጥ ጆርጅ ያጋቲን በህይወቱ የገጠመውን ከተለያዩ ኢነርጂዎች ወይም በhabesha መንፈስ ተብሎ የሚታወቁ ድምጽ እየሰማ ብዙ በህይወቱ ብዙ መከራ ውስጥ እንዳለፈና እነኛን ነገሮች እነኚህ ድምጽ የሚሰማቸውን በህልምም እንዲሁም ደግሞ ሐሳቡ ጭንቅላቱ በሙሉ በተለያየ ሐሳቦች እየተያዘ የሚሰማውን ድምጽ የሚያመጡበት ኔጋቲቭ ኢነርጂ ወይም ደግሞ በኢትዮጵያ ክፉ መናፍስት እንደሆኑ ባወቀ ጊዜ ይህን የሚያታልሉትና ህይወቱን ወደ ብዙ አይነት መጥፎነት ይመሩበት የነበረው ትሪክስ ወይ ማታለል ጌም ኦቨር እንደሆነ እንደተነቃበትና ከዛ በኋላ ራሱ ወጥቶ ለብዙ ሰዎች በአሁኑ ሰዓት በአማዞንና በተለያዩ እንደ ኔትፍሊክስ ባሉ ላይ ቪዲዮዎችንና አውዲዮ መጽሐፎችን እየጻፈ ብዙ ሰዎች መዳን ምክንያት እንደሆነና በዚህም ዩቲዩብ ላይ ልምምዱን ያሳያል። እንደዚህ አይነት ችግር በኢትዮጵያ ውስጥ ብዙ ሰዎች ያለባቸው ሲሆን ብዙ ጊዜ እኔ የሰራውትን ከ2 ሰዓት በፊት ከ3 ሰዓት በፊት የሰራውትን አላቅም ወይም ደግሞ ከነሱ ውጪ የሆነ ባህሪ በራሳቸው ላይ እየተገለጸ የዛ ነገር ግን መገለጭ ማን ያንን ነገር ወይም ያንን መጥፎ ባህሪ በህይወታቸው ላይ እንዳመጣባቸው ሳያውቁ በብዙ ችግር ውስጥ ቢያልፉ ብዙ ሰዎች ስላሉ የነኛ ሰዎች ችግሩን የሚያሳይ ቪዲዮ ትምህርታዊ ቪዲዮ ስለሆነ ለቀነዋል። ተመልከቱት።
የኔ ጀግንነት ይመስላል፣ የኔ ወንድነት ይመስላል። ጎበዝ አንበሳ ይለኛል። ተይዤ ነው ማን እንደሚያስለፈልፈኝ እኔም አላውቀው። ከሰው የሚሆን አይደለም፣ በኔ የሚቻል አይደለም። በኔ እንዲህ አይነት ሰቀቀን ውስጥ ማንም ደፍሮ አይገባም። ማንም ደፍሮ አይገባም። ለምን እንደምናገር ለምን እንደምጽፍ እኔማ ባውቀውና በነገርኳችሁ እና በኔ አንተናት እኔም ወድጄ አይደለም አላውቀውም። ለምን እንደዚህ እንደማደርግ አላውቅም።
Hello again, everybody. This is James Bartley, and you're watching and listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. Today, our special guest is Jerry Marzinsky, an old friend who's been with us several times in the past, along with George Yagotic. George Yagotic is a licensed creative arts psychotherapist who's been battling these voices and has he's developed ways to deal with them. He and Jerry have formed an immensely strong partnership. They now have their own Facebook support group to help people dealing with voices. And George has also got his own Facebook profile, so you can send him a friend request and messages directly. So without any further ado, Jerry Marzinsky and George Yagotic, welcome to the Cosmic Switchboard Show.
Okay, good to be back with you again, James. You know, I'd like to give you all a background of how the mental health system in the Western world has got into such a mess as it is today. Very few cures for anything and drugs for everything. This started back in 1910 in the US with the Rockefellers and the Carnegie Foundation, who sponsored something through Congress. They pushed it through Congress, paying off Congress again, with something called the Flexner Report, an infamous document that shut down any medical school that wasn't teaching pharmaceutically based medicine. That means they made naturopathy illegal, any other kind of natural treatment illegal, electrical treatment illegal, herb treatment, illegal. If you wanted to be a doctor, you had to go to one of these medical schools, such as Johns Hopkins and McGill and a handful of others. All the other schools who were not willing to center their teachings around drugs and were knocked out. And doctors who practiced naturopathy or anything beside pharmacology were called quacks and threatened with their licenses or lost their licenses. So any other treatment other than pharmacology was considered quackery. So Big Pharma unleashed their immense monetary resources into propagandizing the population into believing that everything could be cured by some kind of drug. And there became a big problem with this. I mean, it worked a lot with biological stuff like antibiotics, where there was an actual germ, or antiviruses, or where there was a physiological entity that could be seen and measured and worked with and poisoned with their drugs. When they got to mental health and mental disorders like schizophrenia, they couldn't find anything, so they made things up. You know, schizophrenia was caused by the mother, it was caused by genetics, it was caused by what you ate, it was caused by, I mean, they have this whole line of things over history that schizophrenia was supposed to be caused by. Now they're at the point where they're saying, and they have been for decades, that this is a chemical imbalance in the person's brain. And they're using some of the most dangerous, most destructive drugs in medicine to treat this. You know, now they don't have a germ that they can point to. They don't have a biological entity, and the voices that schizophrenics hear, they say, are hallucinations. Now, I think, you know, the voices are what drives schizophrenia, and they totally ignore it. So they propagandized the population into believing this chemical imbalance theory, but they haven't found any chemical imbalance. Matter of fact, it's been disproven. And the whole reason for psychiatrics being is to dish out drugs that somehow correct, they say correct some kind of chemical imbalance in depression and schizophrenia or whatever, but they haven't been able to find one. You know, it doesn't exist. Matter of fact, research has come out showing that there is none. It doesn't exist. This is one of the biggest scams in human history, and they still push it. There is not a single test that they have that will diagnose schizophrenia or any of these mental illness. They don't have any lab tests. They don't have any EKGs, EEGs. They don't have any kind of test. So when I got to the big state hospital I worked in my earlier days, you know, I was brainwashed to believe in school, as everybody who goes through any kind of psychology, counseling, or psychiatry program, that this mental illness is due to some kind of chemical imbalance. But I saw that they weren't giving any kind of test to schizophrenics before they started pouring drugs down their throats. Oh, you're hearing voices? Here, take this drug, 15 minutes and they're out. You know, and that's the way I've seen most psychiatrists be during my entire career. They spend very little time. You hear voices, you're feeling nervous, here, take this drug, go out, next one comes in. You know, which it's like, you know, oh no, you don't have to take any responsibility for your illness or how you feel. We got a drug for it. Here, you come rely on us, we'll help you. You know? So they use this shotgun approach, and they're still pushing it. If you look at their advertisements today, it's oh yeah, schizophrenia is thought to be a chemical imbalance, or research indicates that it's probably a chemical imbalance. They're still pushing it because they're making $4.7 billion a year with this lie. You know, as long as they can keep people thinking that they have these drugs or fixing some kind of imbalance that they have, and they don't have to take responsibility for their own psyche, they're going to keep pushing it. So part of their scam is this, their DSM, Directory of Mental Disorders. Ever since 1952, they've been increasing the number of these disorders. They started out with 106 in 1952, and they've made up a couple hundred more since then. So today there's over 297, and there's not a lab test or any kind of objective test to objectively measure any of them. They're just what the psychiatrists say. You know, so there's this group of what they call symptoms, but they don't have any kind of entity. There's no biological test for it. It's just these disorders that they've made up. and they've got a drug to cure everything. If you look at the TV, they're advertising, oh yeah, you got this, you feel this way, take this drug. We got this, come and ask your psychiatrist or your doctor to prescribe it for you. So these things are all made up by a group of psychiatrists that get together, and every couple of years they make up more of these mental illnesses, and the drug companies come right up behind them and create some kind of toxic drug to treat them, and then they're being sued, you know, a couple of months later for the damage they're doing. So, you know, some of these illnesses, these psychiatric illnesses that they made up, just to give you a sense of how crazy they can be. Southern Bell syndrome, you know, for Paris syndrome, which is supposed to be a mental disorder only experienced by Japanese nationalists who visit France. Foreign accent syndrome, when someone begins to speak a foreign accent with their native language. Jerusalem syndrome, religiosity themed by obsessive ideas that lead the person to go and visit Israel. Othello syndrome, obsession with a partner's cheating on them. So, you know, Big Pharma is behind this, and they're making a fortune off of this. In 2018, they spent $216.3 million lobbying Congress, outspending virtually every other lobby in Washington. You know, they spent millions and millions on campaign contributions for senators and representatives. 9 out of 10 congressmen and 97 out of 100 senators have taken campaign contributions from Big Pharma. And the drug prices in the US are the highest in the world, twice as high as any other industrialized nation on the planet. Now, these drugs, and like I mentioned previously, they're called neuroleptic drugs. And these are the drugs that George was on, Geodome. This is just, you know, they all have horrible side effects. These are the side effects for Geodome: skin rash, feeling of unstoppable restlessness, inability to sit still, constipation, dizziness, drowsiness, excessive saliva production, extrapyramidal disease, which is one of the most dangerous. This means your peripheral nervous system is being rotted out by these drugs, and your brain is being shrunk. And they will not mention this. They will not tell you this. They will not tell you anything about the side effects. You know, and what makes that most devastating is if the person, you know, most of these people who take these drugs won't go look them up. So they start feeling these side effects and they don't know what's going on. You know, it's like, what's happening to me? What's happening to me? They don't know it's related to the drugs because psychiatry won't tell them. So other stuff, nausea, weight gain, chest pain, tachycardia, interference with sodium. Now, people who take these drugs generally have a lifespan 25 years less than the normal population. These are some of the most dangerous, toxic drugs used in medicine today. You know, and they're supposed to get rid of the voices. In almost all cases, they don't. They might weaken them, you know, and George can talk about this. And in some patients I talk to, you get all those bad side effects and they don't even bother the voices. They don't do anything with the voices, and the voices are what drives paranoid schizophrenia. There's nothing else drives it, it's the voices. It's no germ, it's no chemical imbalance, it's those things. So to show you the damage these guys are doing with these friggin' drugs and the psychiatric mafia's propaganda backed by the drug industry. They now have more than 7.2 million kids on psychiatric drugs. They've got 622,723 children under the age of 5 on these drugs. They've got 80,235 on ADHD drugs, which do work for ADHD. But, you know, while I was working in the prison, there was a lot of them in there that started off on using this for ADHD and ended up addicted to it and psychotic. And I'd ask them, well, why did you keep pushing it when you felt as good as you ever felt? Why did you keep taking that stuff? And they said, I don't know. I don't know. They ended up in prison. The voices, amphetamine will bring on these voices at a rate higher than any other drug I've ever seen. And they start out with, you know, the person starts hearing voices. They think that's a hallucination. And then when they come down, the voices go away. Now that happens several times. It may last over many months. And then one day they don't go away. and then they would be considered psychotic or schizophrenic. And it's exactly the same thing as if you had schizophrenia, only it's induced by these drugs. You know, they've got the biggest number is 389,558 on anti-anxiety drugs. So basically what these people are doing is saying, oh, you don't rely on your own resources to deal with your emotions. You're coming, you got bad emotions, you got bad feelings, come to us, we got a drug for it. Now, what's interesting is that the psychiatrists who are dishing these drugs out, they're the big pharma's drug dispensary. So, you know, the psychiatric mafia is treating one of the schizophrenia, which is one of the top 10 world health problems, with these toxic drugs. You know, and there's millions of people around the planet, 2.5 million in the US alone. Now, this was a few years ago before NIMH decided to reduce that number simply because they were getting a lot of flack for only spending less than $1 a patient on research. So what they did, instead of spending more money on research, they don't want to find a cure. I mean, that would interfere with their income stream. So what they did, NIMH manipulated the statistics in their report and dropped the number of schizophrenics in the US to a couple of 100,000. You know, and now once they did that, now it looks like they're spending, you know, like $30 or something like that on each patient. It's manipulated. They have no intent to find a cure, none. They're making a fortune poisoning these people, and they're freaking getting away with it. I don't know why they're not being sued for the physiological damage that they're doing to these people. You know? Now, what's interesting is the assault rate on psychiatrists is higher than any other doctor out there. You know, they're being assaulted at a rate many times higher than any of the other doctors. And I have the stats here. I won't go through, you know, through them. But what's also interesting is the suicide rate of schizophrenics is one of the highest of all psychiatric populations. I think 5 to 10 times that of the general population. Now, the suicide rate for psychiatrists is almost exactly the same. Not only they are being assaulted by their patients at a higher rate than any other doctor out there, medical doctor out there, they're killing themselves at the same rate as the most disturbed of the mental populations that they work with. So they maintain that the voices that schizophrenics hear, they won't even talk to their patients about them. I mean, this is the main symptom of paranoid schizophrenia. This is the pillar symptom of paranoid schizophrenia, the voices. The voices are doing this. The voices are telling me this. The voices are making me do this. They won't ask the patient what the voices are saying. No curiosity at all. So I started doing that like 30 years ago in the psych hospital. When they found out I was doing that, they called me up in front of the medical director's office and you know, you will not do this. You're making the patient worse by doing this. You're reinforcing their hallucinations. But I already saw they were running patterns. They were running well-defined, predictable patterns. You couldn't talk to psychiatry about that. And anybody in the field who does is going to be in big trouble. You know? So what was interesting is I saw these patterns and started working with them. And then research came out that before the voices spoke, these people who were working with electrophysiological studies, you know, so they on an oscilloscope, when the voices in the schizophrenic's head spoke, there was an electrical discharge that they could actually physiologically see and measure. So if the voices are running repeatable, predictable patterns, they cannot be hallucinations. They're a phenomena that can be predicted. They're not random like hallucinations. Hallucinations are all over the place. They're positive, negatives, they're everywhere. These patterns are predictable, they're repeatable. And you know, I'll let George start off with his experience with psychiatry and how he was treated by them, and then let him lead into these patterns. So basically he's willing to talk to people, and George is one of the bravest most educated, most knowledgeable people I know who is experiencing the voices and is willing, has the guts to come out in public and talk about them. And there's no real benefit for him doing that other than to make people aware of the truth, that these things are not hallucinations, they're very real. They run predictable patterns. We know what they are. It's a totally different world that has its own rules, its own regulations, and its own laws. So let me turn it over to George now, who can give you firsthand experience. Now, everything George is telling you, I can verify by the hundreds and hundreds of patients I've worked with over the 30 years. All these patterns are consistent among all of them. George can bring them to life for you. So George, would you start off with basically what happened to you, how you came to get the voices, and how you were treated by psychiatry once you approached them for help?
Sure, thank you, Jerry. Yeah, you know, the experience of hearing voices is profoundly life-changing, and it's interesting because it begs the question: it's what is this? Where is this coming from? Why is this happening? I think these are questions that go through all of our heads for people who do experience voices initially, and you have to contend with those questions. You have to contend with, you know, what is happening to me? Do I pay attention to it? What do I do with the meaning of what I'm hearing of these voices? And those are huge questions because we're dealing with something that is unseen. I am hearing something that other people around me don't hear. What I'm hearing has meaning, and it affects my life, and it can change my life, and it has an impact. So it's profoundly significant. Now, how it's dealt with in psychiatry is profoundly insignificant because the voices and what people hear and what meaning comes through is not being dealt with. What's being dealt with, as Jerry had said, is the drugs, the pharmaceuticals, and here, take this and they'll go away. Well, they don't. And I'm here to say that the voices are not hallucinations, that they are ego dystonic. And what that means is that they are separate from my sense of self. They are a separate entity. They are something from the outside. It is not something that is unconsciously manifested through subconscious and unconscious. This is something that is manifested outside of our own reality, of our own what's going on around us. And
George, tell them how you came to that conclusion. Remember the password? Tell them that story, and I got one I can follow up, because both of us struggled with what are these things. I mean, I was thinking that they were some part of the patient's subconscious mind for years and years and years, until something happened that shocked me into realizing they weren't. And George had a similar experience with the this password thing. Go ahead and tell the password story, George.
Sure. I think this was the most profoundly significant thing that made me really firmly believe that the voices are dystonic or outside my sense of self. I was beginning to hear, let me back it up and just give you a quick frame of reference. I was addicted to amphetamines and was using amphetamines for a couple of years pretty intensively. What would happen was toward the end is I would begin to use, I would hear the voices, I would stop using, and for about 3-4 days, I would continue to hear the voices, and then they would go away, just as Jerry had described. So it was, the voices were in conjunction with the use of the drugs. At one point, it got to a point where I had over many years, I had tried to stop and had tried to decrease the severity and decrease the use of what I was doing. And at one point, the voices I used, the voices came around, and after 3 or 4 days, they didn't go away. And they have been constant in my life, even after many years of being sober. So it's interesting because something happened, something shifted there. And I think that is significant to note, is that because of this substance, something changed, the voices have not gone away, and here I am. Now, my investigation about what the voices are has been fascinating, simply partly because of my background, because of being a mental health professional and working in the field and knowing about diagnosis and working with people who were schizophrenic before, and understanding how it plays out in a way where I did not have that experience. And so how did I deal with people? Now that I have this experience, it's very different. How I discovered, or how I came to the belief that they were outside of myself and not just something produced internally. When I began hearing the voices, I was hearing things that were not being heard by other people, and it begins to, the natural occurrence is that it kicks up paranoia. Well, what is that? There's something going on around me. I'm paranoid. Where's it coming from? And so paranoid schizophrenia is one of the most popular diagnoses out there. And it's simply because of the question, what is this? Where is it coming from? And who is watching me? You know, who knows what's going on in my head? Well, I began to hear these voices, and I would respond verbally to what I was hearing. And then after a period of time, after they continued, I would stop responding verbally and just think the response, and the voices would respond to me. So I was like, oh, okay, so this is internal. This is more than just, you know, maybe a electrical bug implanted in my apartment. This is something that is internal. I can think a thought and the voices will respond appropriately to that. All right, so we're dealing with something that's pretty, you know, intensely internal. Well, I was paranoid. I was worried about, you know, how this came about, who was watching me, what was going on at the time. And there were things that on my computer that would coincide with what the voices were saying, which was odd for me at the time. Small things, you know, little things here and there. However, I thought to myself, as one might, oh, so maybe they have access to my computer. I'm going to change the password to the whole Wi-Fi system. I was living at a friend's house at the time, and I had another friend come over to change the Wi-Fi password. Now, I want to make it clear, I did not want to know what the password was, because if I knew, the voices would know what the password was. Okay, the logical thinking. All I want to do is have somebody come over, block the password, the Wi-Fi system, so that I could not get in, and then move forward and see what would happen afterwards. So I had a friend come over, and he was in one side of the house changing the password. I went to the other side of the house, did not want to hear, see, know anything about what was going on. As I was in the bathroom washing my hands, one of the voices in my mind said to the other voice in my mind, he's changing the password to password. Now that's new information. That's information that not only did I not know, but it's information I did not want to know. I had no clue, but I knew that I had to verify what was going on to see if these entities, these voices, were some kind of internal manifestation or something that was outside. I immediately went to my friend and I asked him, I said, are you changing the password to password? And he looked up at me and he said, yes, how did you know? And I said, the voices in my head just told me that's what you were doing. And he said, that's exactly what I was doing. Now that was external information. And that to me was the foundational cornerstone of why I believe that these voices have an external source. Now, what is that source? And that's a bigger question. We can ponder all kinds of possibilities. And I have many belief systems that it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. And I think all of those are interesting to discuss. However, there is intention, there's motivation, there is thought behind what I hear, and there is a intention via the voices to gain some type of control over my life. And because it got to a point in my process where that control was not matching with how I wanted to live my life, it became combative, and it turned really challenging and really ugly at times, where the voices would be very negative and would go. I felt like I was under attack in many different ways, because I would not kowtow or allow myself to be in control of these external entities who I have no idea who they are or what they are.
And I had my own, to dovetail what George was saying, I had my own epiphany, I guess you would say, while I was working. I got into trouble for just merely asking patients at the state hospital when I was working what the voices were saying. Ended up on the red carpet in front of psychiatry and the medical director being ordered not to ask them these questions because it was making them worse and reinforcing their hallucinations. And I knew that wasn't true. But in the state hospital, it was like the attacks upon psychiatrists were very prevalent. So they didn't want anything that anybody did that upset these guys, they didn't want to have happen. And if one of them went off in your office, everybody goes, oh, hey, what'd you do to set him off? You just didn't do anything to set them off. You had to kind of walk on pins and needles. And if you did something wrong. Where I really started learning about the voices and what they were and how they operated was when I went to work in the psych department of the state prison. There, you could ask them all the questions you wanted about the voices, and if they went off, it didn't even break the ambient noise level of that place. So I surrounded myself with a bunch of prisoners who were hearing voices that I felt I could trust, and I would work with them based, the deal was I would do everything I could to help them out, keep them out of trouble, but they had to tell me in real time what their voices were saying at the time I was talking to them. And it was very clear that it was the voices that were driving schizophrenia. They were causing all of this, and nobody was looking at that, and nobody was asking them questions except me. So what I figured is, well, okay, if they're the driving force behind this disorder, then let's see what happens if we start interfering with them, breaking them up, tripping them up. So I started thinking of ways to do that. And then I would give the prisoners homework, and then next time I had them in, well, what happened? Did it work? How much did it work? Did it work at all? Until finally we had a number of ways to disrupt these voices. And the prison, not just one, but several of them would come back into my office the next point and say, the voices are really getting pissed off with you. They don't like what you're doing. They don't want me coming here. They're telling me not to come. They're telling me to assault you. It was clear that the voices didn't like it. Now, I learned back at the very start that to find out what they really are, you got to throw something at them that they don't like. It's like hitting them back. And then you find out the depths of their depravity. It's only then. You can't make friends with them because they'll eat you up. So I had prisoners come in and say, I remember one comes in after he left, he stopped at the door and he said, what you're doing is dangerous, don't you? And I looked at him and I'm like perplexed. I never thought about it. I'm thinking, well, they're in their heads. They can't get me. They can't come into my head. I mean, they're stuck in their head, And I felt I was relatively safe, but little did I know what I know now. I mean, so I kept getting these reports that, the voices don't like you. They don't want me coming here. They're telling me all these bad things. And I just kept going and finding more and more ways to disrupt them until one day, one of the prisoners I've been working with for like 6 months comes and knocks on my door without an appointment, and let him in. I said, well, what's up, man? And he goes, the voices want to talk to you. And I've never talked to them directly before this. I mean, it was always through the patient. What are they saying? They tell me what they were saying, and the voices are saying calling me names and all kinds of stuff. And they're saying this, they're calling you this, they're saying you're crazy, you're stupid, that kind of stuff. I said, well, go tell them to stick their head in the toilet. And one day, when this guy comes in, he goes, the voices want to talk to you. And he's making good progress. And we were pretty well beating down his voices. And I said, well, come in, sit down. What do they have to say? And he looks at me, and his voice changes just a little deeper. And hear these words come out of his mouth. You have no right to interfere with our way of life. And I'm like, our way of life. plural. That's not the patient talking. And then the prisoner said, that wasn't me, that was them. That was them talking. And something like, I said, well, yeah, something will tell them this. And he said something like, well, I don't have to tell them anything. They can hear everything you're saying. They can see everything you're doing. So they actually were using the patient's eyes and ears and senses to communicate. It's like, what Carlos Castaneda said, that the voices or these entities give you their mind. So it's a split mind. And that's where probably the only thing that psychiatry's got right is that it is a split mind. It's the person's mind.
I think it's interesting, Jerry, that some people call it schizophrenia and that they deal with it in a schizophrenic paradigm, mental paradigm. And other people call it channeling. I'm channeling this entity, and they channel and speak, that entity speaks through them, and it's taken in a different way. That paradigm shift is different because of because of what comes through. And I think it's interesting to note, the relationship that one has with these entities and why that relationship is why it is, and with your work in the prison system, and having these entities invade somebody's sanctity of mind, it might be one way and one type of relationship. Whereas with other people who deal with channeling and who deal with connections with higher powers in different ways, they have very different relationships, and they have very different conversations and very different ways of dealing with these beings. And I think the important thing to note here, bottom line out of this program, is that the people who hear voices, it's real in our society, and there is something in terms of the unseen world that we are living with that we have no clue about. And the US healthcare system deals with it in one very biomedical perspective. And we have to step back from that biomedical perspective, and we have to say, no, let's figure out what's happening in your head. What is the relationship that's going on in your head, and how are you dealing with it? How are you contending with it? Why are you dealing with it? One of the things, many times over the couple of years that I've been hearing voices now, what I've gone through are these life lessons. Voices have taught me life lessons. And it's been really interesting to go through these growing stages of hearing something outside of what I wouldn't necessarily be thinking about, wouldn't be focusing on, and how it changed me as a person. And I feel that in many ways, this process of working with these voices has helped me understand myself better in many ways. And in many ways, it has been terribly challenging to contend with a certain loss of peace. And so my process throughout all of this was, how do I perceive these entities? What do I feel like they are, and what are they doing to me, and how am I working through that? And as somebody with a very positive perspective in life, one of the things I think that has saved me over the course of time of hearing these voices is figuring out ways of coping with, of dealing with the relationship with these voices, setting boundaries, setting limits, and having conversations at times that were productive. There are I think the majority of situations at this point are about trying to draw me down and to drag my energetic level down.
George, would you say this is a spiritual phenomenon?
It's absolutely, yeah.
That's one thing. That's one thing that the medical people are totally ignoring. They treat the person like a machine, and totally ignore that we're spiritual beings with spiritual maladies, and they can't comprehend a disorder or a disease or a sickness that has no physical cause and no physical cure. So they're denying the whole spiritual aspect of the human being. It's like you're a machine. You're broken, take these drugs, take these physical things to fix it. So what happened is George started noticing these same patterns that I did, and we can learn a lot from these patterns. And so, George, go ahead and go into the patterns. You were talking about the battle for control, that they were constantly trying to get more and more control over you, and trying to constantly maneuver for your attention.
It was an interesting process. Initially, when I began hearing these voices constantly, there was an inquisition that happened. There was a getting to know me, and it was a very amiable relationship. And in retrospect, I look back into it and I say, well, it had to have been amiable, because how else would I allow myself to open up fully and to get to know who I am? And so I look back at the voices being amiable at that time as strategic, because it got to a point after a certain amount of time of getting to know me, it got to a point where they wanted control. And they would set dictates. You have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this. And I would say, no, that's not what I want to do. They wanted me to be vegan. And I was like, I tried it for a little while, and I'm like, no, that's not who I am. And they say, you have to be vegan as a dictate. And when they put the dictate down, I immediately went, okay, this is not right. This is not good. Why would something that was loving and of God and of a kind of a higher power put a dictate down like you have to be vegan? And when I would go against it, they would attack me in various different ways. And I said, this is not right, and it's not loving. And so I ended up going against it, and there was conflict, and there was ways of dealing with this negativity. But the intention was to, after the initial kind of amiable period of relationship, it became one of control. And
this is common.
It is a battle of control. And what I have to say, what I want to put out there is that for people who hear voices, there is a certain intrusion into our life of a piece of, I don't have that quietude of mind that people who don't hear voices have all the time.
So you're dealing with the upsets, that generation of negative emotional energy throughout all these patterns. Every single pattern is aimed at the generation of negative emotional energy, which then gets sucked off.
There are ways that the voices can pull at you and can drain you emotionally if you don't go with what they're saying. And I think that's that thin line around your relationship with the voices and how do you contend with it. But as soon as it turns negative, these patterns play out, and these patterns of manipulation of how they try to drag you down into negativity and really eat away at who you are as a person. And the one thing I want to get across, James and Jerry, that I think is one of the most important things is that these voices build up an internal belief system. They build it up in you, and you have to understand that you don't need to believe what the voices say, because it could be completely, it could be a lie. And also, you don't have to listen to the voices. What I've learned to do is I learned to overtalk the voices so that the meaning at which they want to project into my reality is not heard, because I'm overtalking them. And when I overtalk them, that intention doesn't get through, and therefore the intention, the directive of the voices doesn't affect my life. And I think holding on to my sense of self has been one of the best things I've been able to do to kind of move forward in life and cope with what I'm contending with, because they try to draw you into different ways of being, different ways of perceiving life through what you're hearing in your mind. And
so they will bend your perception. They'll warp your perception.
it can be extremely detrimental, and they do it using very specific patterns, and that's the patterns that Jerry and I.
So yeah, and moving through these patterns, I mean, we've gone almost an hour now. We only hit the first one. So the second one is voices are consistently negative, derogatory, insulting, abusive, and destructive. They can fake to be positive and helpful, but invariably turn on their victim once they gain the victim's trust. That happens in most cases. Now, I do know of 2 cases where the person is hearing a positive voice and it doesn't do any of these. But in most cases, they'll get your trust. They'll reel you in. Once you trust them, they say, oh, hey, we got supernatural powers. We know these things. We can help you here. And they kind of get your trust, and then they slowly turn on you. Did you experience that, George?
Oh, absolutely. As I said before, in the beginning of the relationship was amiable, and then it got to a point where things would turn, and that's consistent with my experience. It was like, if you buy into what you're hearing and what you're experiencing, which is what the voices want, you begin to become under their control, because they are dictating what your reality is around you. They'll say, oh, don't listen to that person, they don't like you. Listen to that person, that they're influencing you.
And they're constantly driving to.
But if you buy into what they are saying, their influence, that influence has power over you, and you can't do that. And so you have to take what the voices say with a grain of salt, hold on to yourself, and hold on to the external reality of what is going on with that around you in a non-judgmental kind of open way.
And they constantly fish for your attention, right? They go after your attention in any way they can grab it.
Right.
Is that not so?
It's an internal experience. And if I'm not listening to the voices, or if I'm blocking them out, they work harder to drag my attention away from this reality and into my head.
So what psychiatry tell these guys, almost every single one of them, is just ignore the voices. It's not that easy. You can't ignore the voices.
You cannot ignore the voices. There's constantly something there. It's like having a TV on in the background. I can turn my awareness to it and listen to it whenever I want. But if I'm in this reality, is sitting in this chair, having this interview right now, that's the priority. As soon as I move my awareness to that TV in my mind, or those voices in my mind, it takes me out of this reality. And I think you can't do that. You've got to be able to not just balance it, but understand where the priorities are, and understand how to deal with this reality first, before contending with this belief system that is being concocted by voices in your mind.
Well, it's being concocted, but it's being concocted consistently. I mean, this is another world that exists, that everybody has these symptoms. They have these thoughts, but not to the extent that a schizophrenic would. So what we're talking about is a normal curve here, with the schizophrenic being at the very end, but it's all one population. These things hit all of us all the time to different degrees, and they're negative, they're derogatory, they're constant. The game plan, like George said, is they're after control, and they're after the generation of a negative emotional state, which they then drain off of you.
Which, Jerry, and just to underscore your point, if it's not just the schizophrenic that experiences these voices, it's
everybody.
If there is something external out there that is having some influence on you, because I hear the voices, it has connection or potential contact with anybody. And so how does it affect you? Maybe other people actually hear voices that are outside or ego dystonic, outside of their sense of self, but they think that they're their own thoughts. Oh,
yes.
That's something I thought. And
glad you brought that up.
That's where you have to be careful, because these external entities are out there playing with our minds, our thoughts, and our feelings. And it's very, very separate how they affect my feelings and how they affect what I'm hearing. But it's not just the schizophrenic. It's not just the drug-induced psychosis person who is experiencing this. I think we all are affected by these entities. Now, yes. What these entities are, whether they're angels or demons, whether we call them aliens, whether we call them archons or extraterrestrials, I'm not putting forth a belief system about what exactly it is. Could be technology, but what is true in my experience is that these beings have intention, they have patterns, and much of what they try to do when you begin to go against what they say is to draw you down in very, very negative ways by pulling you out of this reality and pulling you into this internal world that they want to concoct or make up in very, very not good perspectives, so that you begin to generate negative energies of shame, of guilt, of oh, I'm worthless, I'm bad.
So what you're talking about is an operational definition. An operational definition of what you don't have to call them demons or anything. This is what they do. This is how they operate, and the way they operate is not good. It's destructive. It's poisonous. Right. It's draining. It's dysfunctional. So you don't have to struggle with a name that you can. This is how they operate. This is what they do. This is what they are.
I've got a question.
What they do is what they are.
I've got a question for George. We're surrounded, immersed, if you will, in multimedia, be it the corporate media, the internet, radios playing in the background. Are there times when it seems that it could go one way or the other, but some of the memes prevalent in society by all of this multimedia seem to reinforce some of the messages of the voices, if you will? Or, for example, does the potential exist if you take a certain demographic of society and let's say that there's an overarching agenda to manipulate certain demographics in certain directions, be it to be climate change activists, be it to be political activists, whatever the case may be, is it possible for the multimedia, if you will, to reinforce what the voices are saying, and connected with that, can the voices subtly, or whatever the case may be, encourage people to mistrust this politician, to mistrust this person on an individual, interpersonal relationship level, mistrust this, or conversely, endorse some kind of movement, some kind of political movement? Now, what are your thoughts on that?
It's an interesting question, and I think what's important to note is that many people use the term matrix about the world we live in, and you have to think about that as a metaphor, because each one of us, our realities are created. They're created by what we see, by what we hear, by what we see on TV, by what we hear in our friends, from our friends around us and the people in our lives. Our realities, our worldview, our perspective on how we get through life is created. That's that matrix quality, and that's what we're talking about. Now, if you have voices that are coming in, and remember, each and every person's experience of voices is individualistic, okay? My experience is going to be different than the next person. However, there are, as Jerry and I had said, there are certain patterns that show up in terms of and how the voices work. But the belief systems and the belief structures that one creates are individualistic. And so if, let's say, the voices had the intention of wanting me to move away from this home in which I'm living in, which is one of the things that my voices told me, they wanted me to move out of the home I'm living in, which again goes against my intention. Then they begin to do or say things against where I'm living. Oh, it's a bad place. Oh, you shouldn't do this. Oh, we're going to make it harder for you to live here. Oh, we're going to do this, that, and the other, right? And so that intention comes through in different ways and can influence my decision to either live here or not. Now, if everybody hears voices and we don't know what exactly or who they are, this is not just one person talking into a microphone for everybody on the planet. We're talking about, well, what kind of spiritual entity could do this? And I think that question is interesting, because what bigger picture games are going on? How are we all being influenced in different ways via TV? And if the voices are out there, and they are influencing, I think, not just individuals, but groups of people, populations of people,
Entire
via
nations.
things like entire nations, via things like the media or politics or so on and so forth. So we're not just talking about something that is my own personal inner experience and that is going to pull me away from reality, but has a potential huge way of influencing the masses in ways that are even greater in terms of where does that influence take us? And I think that those are interesting conversations, not necessarily what we want to get into at this point.
Well, this goes back to the societal belief that's programmed in us all from birth that all your thoughts belong to you. They're your own. And they're not. Swedenborg brought that up 700 years ago. Not every thought that comes through your head belongs to you. Now, Sherry, who struggled with voices as a young woman, she said every negative thought about yourself or somebody else is inserted into your thought stream by these entities for the purpose of splitting you from your relationships with human beings, taking you away from your family. They constantly say bad things about parents and family members. They'll split the person up from their family so they can't get any support. They'll isolate them, and then they'll corner them, and like George says, then they'll start into them. They want to drag them into that world and not have anybody pull them back out. So there's this constant pulling to pull them away from friends, from family, from people that can help them, and convince the victim that these guys are after them. They don't have their best interest at heart. They're talking behind their backs. They're plotting against them. And once they have them isolated, and that's what happens, they isolate themselves, and then the voices are unimpeded. Would you say, George?
Absolutely. Again, I think if one begins to believe that, oh, these voices I'm hearing are my own voice, then you begin to have a problem because you can't extricate yourself from the influence that the voices come in and the negativity that it can produce. And
you had a struggle. You had a struggle to at one point to figure, and they all do. We all do. What is your thoughts and what are theirs? Okay, since they're all appearing in your head, could you talk about the struggle you had to identify which thoughts belong to you and which thoughts belong to them, since they all appear as thoughts within your own mind, and
that's
the voices are inserted?
Great question. And we have to clarify the difference between a thought and a voice, because I actually hear in my mind something that sounds like a voice. It doesn't sound like it's coming outside, that it's happening in the room. I experience it in my mind. It's telepathy. It sounds like telepathy. I am experiencing a voice that sounds like I can hear it, but it's inside my mind. Now, a thought may not necessarily have a voice. It could be a concept. It could be an idea like Christmas, and just think about what Christmas might be. Not the word Christmas, because that's the voice, but the concept of Christmas. And that's the thought. So there's thoughts and there's voices. And I think what was interesting in my own process to parse out is the difference between other, what is the voice of the other that is intruding itself on my mind, and what is my own thoughts? Where is my own voice? And it has actually helped me to find my own voice that differentiates from the other voice that comes in. And it's interesting in many different ways how this is played out. One of the ways that the voices build belief systems is they will begin a sentence. It's not me thinking and it's not my voice. And they will say, we are going to, and then they'll pause. And then my own mind, or my own conceptual mind belief system, will finish the sentence. Mess with your day is what I might think of. Okay, so the voices say, we are going to, and then wherever my headspace is at, I will finish it with my voice, mess with your day. And then all of a sudden it becomes a sentence, a coherent whole piece of idea. And
it made it sound like your thought.
It made it
Because-
sound like it was my thought all along.
because you added onto it.
Right. So what I learned to do is they would begin the sentence, we are going to, and I would pause my thoughts. And I would stop and I would clear my mind and I would realize that was them. That was them. And I would not think anything and I would just clear my mind. And then I would say something, I would turn it around, have a beautiful day. I would turn it around and I would hear and I would listen to the voice in my head that was my voice. And so I began to differentiate between what is my voice and what is other. And I think that that process of learning has been really important because of how the influence is so Machiavellian on all of us, on how these, what do we know of ourselves and what do we know of as something that is influencing us outside of ourselves, you know, and it's an interesting thought.
Yeah, so they kind of remind me of lions or tigers hiding in the jungle. You know, so here's all these hundreds of thoughts that come through your head in a day, and all of a sudden this negative one pops up out of nowhere. So, you know, and it's usually these things are inserting negative thoughts that generate negative emotion. And all of us experience it. You know, we've all experienced this. Some you're walking down the sidewalk and some awful thought just barges into your head that is so shocking that you would never act on. You don't want to even think about it. You're embarrassed that you even thought that thought, and it upsets you. You know, where did that thought come from? It didn't belong in your thought stream. You know,
Right.
It's nothing you would ever normally think.
As an example, one day I was in my apartment cooking and I went to take my dog for a walk and I get to the corner and immediately I had this thought, you need to go kill yourself. And it was so bizarre. It was so bizarre out of nowhere. And I thought, what was that about? Now, the interesting thing here, Jerry, one of the medications I was on at the time, the side effects are suicidal
thoughts. So there you go. Here's a psychiatrist giving people meds, and that's common too. That's common.
Right. My mind went to, well, the medication did this. This is interesting. But what if some of these thoughts that are coming in our head that are messing with, you know, our ability to figure out how head medications, how psychiatric medications actually work, are induced by these entities. And I like the word entity because it's broad, because it could be one thing or another. But these entities are real, and these entities are out there influencing us and influencing us in ways in which we can, influencing our thoughts, influencing our feelings, and influencing how we go about our lives in a variety of ways that we are unaware of.
And usually in a negative manner. So, you know, the voices consistently work toward the creation of a prolonged negative emotional state in their victim, including anger, paranoia, guilt, anxiety, guilt, shame, and they drive their victim to generate virtually every negative emotional thing they can experience. And what I've seen is they have complete access to the victim's mind. They can go in there and they can pull up negative things that the person has done that they forgot 20 years ago and bring it up and rub it in their face and say, you did this, you're rotten, you're no good, until they generate that negative emotional state and then they drain it. Can you speak to that, George?
Well, George, hold that thought because we've reached the end of the first segment, and it's been fascinating discussion. We're just, you know, getting into it. Jerry, can you give our listeners your contact information and how they could find you?
Well, I guess the biggest one is our website at jerrymarzinski.com. You know, so we got videos there. We've got a book Sherry and I wrote about these things in the book section there. I got it back here. So, you know, George read this, and he said the part where Van Dusen and Manuel Swedenborg are speaking about the voices. And what was your reaction when you read that section, George?
It never made it more clear in terms of how these different types of motion of voices played out inside me. Van Dusen really speaks well about how these things work. And I think your book is well written for people who are interested in it, and who want to learn more about how these entities can influence us. Should definitely read your book and definitely understand that it's a really huge issue that is not talked about enough.
And George, people can contact you on Facebook, George Yagotic, and you both have a Facebook support group for people dealing with these issues. And I should stress, George is a retired licensed creative arts psychotherapist. So we've had a fascinating discussion with Jerry Marzinski and George Yagotic, and we're just getting started. You've been watching and listening to the Cosmic Switchboard Show. If you like what we do, if you believe in what we do, please go to thecosmicswitchboard.com, sign up and become a member, and we'll see you at the top of the next segment.
you